Britain is full of small villages that have been home to families for hundreds of years. But some of those villages have a very different story. In one, the residents were told to pack their things and leave during World War II. They thought they would come back, but they never did. Another village now sits beneath a reservoir, while much of another was slowly swallowed by the sea. And far off the coast of Scotland, an entire island community reached a point where staying was simply no longer possible. So, what happened to these places, and why were they left behind? Here are 7 British villages with incredible stories of abandonment, starting with number 7. Number 7 is Imber, Wiltshire. Deep inside Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire sits a village that looks as if its residents simply disappeared. Its name is Imber, and for hundreds of years it was a small farming community where families lived quiet rural lives. The village had houses, farms, a school, a pub and St Giles' Church. But in November 1943, during World War II, everything changed. The people of Imber were called to a meeting and given shocking news. The British military needed the village and surrounding land to train soldiers for the Allied invasion of Europe. Residents were given just 47 days to leave their homes. Around 150 people had to pack their belongings and move away from a place where some families had lived for generations. Many residents believed the evacuation would only be temporary. Britain was at war, so people accepted that sacrifices had to be made, and some expected they would be allowed home once the fighting ended. But when the war was finally over, the villagers weren't allowed to permanently return. The military continued using the area for training, and former residents spent years fighting for the right to go back. Today, Imber remains inside an active military training area. Many original buildings have disappeared or been damaged, while military training structures were later added. St Giles' Church still survives, and on selected days when access is allowed, visitors can enter the village. What makes Imber so sad is that its people didn't leave because they wanted a different life. They walked away believing they might one day return, without knowing that they were actually saying goodbye to their village forever. Number 6 is Tyneham, Dorset. Imber wasn't the only British village emptied during World War II. In Dorset, another peaceful community faced a remarkably similar fate. Tyneham was a small rural village near the coast, surrounded by beautiful countryside. Families had lived there for generations, and the community had cottages, farms, a school and St Mary's Church. Then, in 1943, the War Office decided it needed the surrounding area for military training. Around 225 people from Tyneham and the surrounding area were required to leave before Christmas. The villagers accepted the decision as part of Britain's war effort, believing that giving up their homes would help the country during one of the most difficult periods in its history. Before leaving, a resident placed a famous note on the church door asking people to treat the church and houses carefully because the villagers hoped to return one day. But just like the people of Imber, they never permanently returned. After the war, the area continued to be used for military training, and Tyneham slowly became frozen in time. Today, the village can sometimes be visited when the military range is open. The old school has been restored, St Mary's Church has been preserved, and ruined cottages still show where families once lived. Walking through Tyneham feels strange because there was no natural disaster that suddenly destroyed it. People simply packed their belongings, closed their doors and walked away, expecting their absence to be temporary. More than 8 decades later, their village remains empty. Number 5 is Wharram Percy, North Yorkshire. At number 5, we travel much further back in time. Hidden among the rolling countryside of North Yorkshire are the remains of Wharram Percy, one of Britain's most famous deserted medieval villages. Unlike Imber or Tyneham, there wasn't one dramatic day when everyone was ordered to leave. Instead, Wharram Percy disappeared slowly over generations. People had lived in this area for centuries, and during the Middle Ages it developed into a farming community with houses, fields, and a church. Families worked the surrounding land, raised animals, and lived lives that probably seemed permanent to them. But medieval England was changing, and small rural communities like this one were extremely vulnerable. Disease, population changes, and new ways of using farmland all affected villages across England. The Black Death caused enormous population loss during the 14th century, But Wharram Percy's final decline happened later. During the 15th and early 16th centuries, landowners increasingly turned agricultural land into sheep pasture because wool could be highly profitable. That meant fewer farming families were needed. Residents gradually disappeared, homes were abandoned, and by the early 16th century Wharram Percy was effectively deserted. Centuries later, archaeologists extensively studied the site, making it one of the best-known deserted medieval settlements in Britain. Today, you won't see rows of complete abandoned houses. Instead, you can see earthworks showing where buildings once stood, along with the ruins of St Martin's Church. Looking across the peaceful fields, it's difficult to imagine that this was once a living community filled with families. Wharram Percy proves that a village doesn't always disappear because of one huge disaster. Sometimes it simply fades away until almost nothing remains. Number 4 is Dunwich, Suffolk. At number 4 is a place with an almost unbelievable story. Imagine an important town slowly disappearing into the sea until streets, homes and churches that once stood on dry land were sitting beneath the waves. That is what happened to medieval Dunwich on the Suffolk coast. Dunwich still exists today as a small village, but centuries ago it was much larger and more important. During the medieval period, it was a major port with churches, religious buildings, homes, and a busy local economy. Ships came and went, people worked near the harbor, and the settlement was one of the important coastal communities of eastern England. But Dunwich had one enemy that it could never defeat: the North Sea. Powerful storms repeatedly hit the coastline, with a particularly destructive storm in 1286 causing severe damage. More storms followed, while coastal erosion continued eating away at the land. Buildings were destroyed, parts of the town disappeared, and changes to the coastline made the harbor increasingly difficult to use. Over the following centuries, large sections of medieval Dunwich were lost beneath the sea. Modern research has helped map archaeological remains offshore, giving us a better idea of where parts of the old settlement once stood. Dunwich was never completely abandoned, because a much smaller community survives there today, but the large medieval town that once made it important is gone. When you stand on the beach now and look toward the North Sea, you're looking across water that covers land where people once walked, worked, and lived. Dunwich is a powerful reminder that even a successful settlement can disappear when nature refuses to stop moving. Number 3 is Hallsands, Devon. Hallsands is a village that lost its battle with the sea. Hallsands once stood on the Devon coast, squeezed between steep cliffs and the water. For generations, families lived here, and many depended on fishing for their income. By the late 19th century, the village had dozens of houses and more than 150 residents. Life beside the sea had always carried risks, but the community had survived for generations. Then large amounts of shingle began being dredged from nearby waters as part of work connected with the expansion of the naval dockyard at Plymouth. Local residents became worried because the beach helped protect their homes from powerful waves, and they feared that removing material from the area could leave Hallsands dangerously exposed. The dredging eventually stopped, but the coastline had changed. Then, in January 1917, a powerful storm hit. Huge waves crashed into Hallsands, destroying or severely damaging much of the village. Residents managed to escape without being killed, but their community was effectively finished. Many families could never return to normal life there, and the remains of Hallsands were gradually left behind. Today, ruined buildings can still be seen from a viewing platform, sitting dangerously close to the water below the cliffs. What makes Hallsands especially fascinating is that residents had warned about the danger years before the final disaster. The sea delivered the final blow, but the story also became connected to questions about human changes to the coastline. More than a century later, the ruins remain as a reminder of a village that once stood between the cliffs and the sea. Number 2 is Derwent, Derbyshire. Derwent is a village that wasn't destroyed by fire, war, or the sea. Instead, it was deliberately sacrificed and flooded. Derwent once stood in the upper Derwent Valley in Derbyshire, surrounded by beautiful countryside. Families lived in homes and farms throughout the area, but growing cities needed larger and more reliable water supplies. Plans were made to create a major reservoir in the valley, and that meant communities standing in the way would have to disappear. Derwent, along with nearby Shopton, was directly affected. Residents had to leave, buildings were demolished, and graves from the churchyard were moved before the water arrived. When Lady Bower Reservoir was completed in the 1940s, water covered the site of the old village. Derwent had disappeared beneath the surface. But unlike many lost villages, parts of its story occasionally return to view. During periods of very low reservoir levels, remains connected with the old settlement can sometimes become visible again. It creates an eerie scene because you're suddenly looking at pieces of a landscape normally hidden beneath the water. Imagine standing beside the reservoir knowing that somewhere below the surface were homes, roads and places where generations of people spent their everyday lives. Derwent wasn't simply abandoned and allowed to fall apart. The entire landscape around it was transformed, and the village was replaced by a huge body of water that still serves an important purpose today. Number 1 is Hirta Island, Outer Hebrides. At number 1, we travel far into the North Atlantic to one of Britain's most isolated abandoned communities. St Kilda is a remote group of islands in Scotland's Outer Hebrides, and Hirta is the largest island and the place where the main community lived. For generations, a small population survived here in conditions that seem incredibly difficult today. The islanders were separated from mainland Britain by miles of rough ocean. They raised livestock, grew crops and collected seabirds and their eggs from dangerous cliffs. Everything about life on Hirta required skill, courage and cooperation. In such an isolated place, neighbors depended heavily on one another, and the community developed a way of life unlike almost anywhere else in Britain. But isolation eventually became a serious problem. As the modern world changed, young people began leaving, the population declined, and the remaining residents became increasingly dependent on outside supplies and assistance. Illness could become dangerous because medical help was far away, and maintaining everyday life became harder with fewer people. By 1930, the remaining islanders decided that they could no longer continue. They asked to be evacuated, and on August 29, 1930, the final 36 residents left Hirta for mainland Scotland. After generations of continuous community life, the village fell silent. The old stone buildings still stand on Hirta today, facing the same wild Atlantic Ocean that shaped the lives of the people who once lived there. Unlike Imber and Tyneham, there was no military order forcing the residents out, and unlike Derwent, there was no reservoir waiting to cover their homes. The community simply reached a point where surviving in such an isolated place was no longer practical. Today, St Kilda is internationally protected for its remarkable natural and cultural importance, but the abandoned village remains one of its most powerful sites. Walking among those stone buildings, you can imagine generations of families looking out across the Atlantic from one of Britain's most remote communities. Then, one summer day in 1930, the final residents sailed away, and after centuries of human voices, their village became silent. These 7 places were left behind for completely different reasons. But all 7 places remind us of the same thing: no community is guaranteed to last forever. War, nature, development, economic change, or simple isolation can transform a living village into an abandoned place. And across Britain, many more forgotten settlements are still hiding beneath fields, behind military fences, under reservoirs, and even beneath the sea. If you enjoyed exploring these abandoned British villages, subscribe to the channel, because there are many more forgotten places and incredible stories still waiting to be discovered.